There are places in the world where the weight of tradition is not a metaphor. It is not a feeling, not an abstraction, not something you carry loosely the way most of us carry the customs of our upbringing. It is structural. It is the architecture of an entire life. It determines what you wear, where you go, who you speak to, how you are seen, and what happens to you if you step outside its boundaries. For most people raised within it, that structure is not experienced as a cage. It is experienced as safety, as identity, as the very shape of who you are. And that is what makes a story like this one so devastating. Not because the people in it are villains or monsters, but because they were ordinary human beings, flawed, lonely, capable of terrible mistakes, living inside a system of expectations so total, so unforgiving, that when the human parts of them began to overflow those boundaries, the consequences were not just personal. They were catastrophic, and they were permanent. Today I want to tell you a story from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The year is 2008, and at the center of it is a young woman named Samira. Samira was 28 years old when this story begins. She had been raised in a traditional family, educated within the boundaries that her community held as sacred, and married at 23 to a man named Faisal, a match arranged with the full approval of both families, conducted with propriety, celebrated with sincerity. Faisal was wealthy. His family was respected. The house he brought Samira to was large and well-appointed, in one of Riyadh's established residential neighborhoods, with high walls and quiet courtyards and every material comfort a young bride could reasonably expect. What it did not have, and what Samira would spend the next several years slowly understanding the depth of, was her husband's presence. Faisal was a businessman in the truest and most consuming sense of the word. His work required travel, weeks in Dubai, extended stays in London, business that kept him on planes and in conference rooms and in the company of associates and partners who had claims on his time and attention that his young wife, waiting at home in a house she had not chosen, in a city where her social world was tightly circumscribed, simply could not compete with. This was not malice on Faisal's part. It is important to say that clearly. He provided. He was not unkind. By the standards of what he understood a husband's obligations to be, he was fulfilling them. But Samira was 23 when she married, and 28 when this story begins. And in those 5 years, she had learned something about herself that she had no clean language for, because the language available to her did not easily accommodate what she was experiencing. She was not unhappy with her faith. She was not resentful of her culture in any abstract sense. She was simply, profoundly, in the specific and consuming way that solitary people in large houses understand, alone. Her days had a shape, but not a texture. The household ran, prayers were observed. She was a dutiful wife in every visible way. But there is a particular kind of emptiness that has nothing to do with the presence or absence of things, and everything to do with the presence or absence of being truly known by another person. And Samira, by 2008, was living in the center of that emptiness every day. Into this stillness came Amir. Faisal's father was in his early 60s at the time. He was a man of standing in his community, not in a political or official sense, but in the way that older men of a certain background and bearing carry authority simply by existing in a room. He had a quality of attentiveness that people found reassuring. He listened carefully. He spoke thoughtfully. He had the kind of presence that made younger people feel considered rather than dismissed. And in a household where Samira often felt like furniture, beautiful, maintained, and essentially ignored, his attention was something she had no defenses against. He began visiting more frequently after Faisal's business travel intensified. He would come to check on the household, he said, to ensure that his son's wife had what she needed, that nothing was lacking, that she was not finding the long absences too difficult. These were the stated reasons, and in the beginning, they were probably genuine. He was a father-in-law fulfilling a familial obligation. There was nothing, in those first visits, that anyone watching would have been alarmed by. But attention is its own form of intimacy. And for a woman who had been living in emotional isolation for years, being noticed, really noticed, in the specific and personal way that Amir had of making people feel seen, was not a neutral experience. It was, to use a word that the situation does not deserve, but that is nonetheless accurate, nourishing. And she returned to it the way people return to warmth when they have been cold for a very long time. Have you ever felt the pull of something you know with absolute certainty is wrong? Not wrong in the minor, manageable way of most human mistakes, but wrong in the way of something that could unravel your entire life, everything you were raised to be, everything you believe about yourself, and felt that pull anyway? That is not a comfortable question, but it is an honest one, and it is the only question that allows us to understand how Samira got from where she began to where she ended up. What developed between Samira and Amir over the course of 2008 and into the following years was not reckless or sudden. It was, in its own terrible way, gradual. A conversation that lasted longer than it should have. A moment of contact, a hand offered in comfort, perhaps, or a gesture of reassurance that carried more weight than its surface suggested. Small transgressions that made the next one feel less significant, until the accumulated distance from where they had started was so vast that there was no longer any pretending about what this was. It was an affair. Between a man in his 60s and his son's wife, taking place in the son's house, under the son's roof, against every prohibition that both of them had been raised to hold as foundational. In a society and a faith that treat such violations not as personal failures, but as crimes against the social and moral order itself. Imagine for a moment the specific weight of that. Not the passion of it, which is what people in situations like this tend to focus on, because passion is at least legible. Imagine the other thing, the constant, grinding awareness of what you are doing. The prayers you continue to perform while living this double life. The way you speak about the absent husband to his father while knowing what you are concealing from that husband. The way every ordinary moment of the household becomes a kind of performance, a surface you maintain with increasing effort over a reality that has become completely unrecognizable to anyone who knew you before. That is what Samira's life had become by 2012, a performance, an exhausting, unrelenting performance of the ordinary person she had been, maintained over the ruins of who she actually was. And performances of that kind, sustained over years, extract a cost that eventually shows on the performer whether they intend it to or not. Faisal noticed. He noticed first in the small ways that husbands notice things when they have not been paying close enough attention. A quality of distraction in his wife that he initially attributed to loneliness, which he knew was a real thing she experienced, and then to health, and then to some vague emotional difficulty that he did not have the vocabulary to address directly. He was a man of his generation and his culture, and direct emotional conversation was not a tool he had been given. He watched. He felt something wrong without being able to name it. Then, in the way that these things happen, the circles around Samira began to speak, not in any organized or deliberate way. Extended family absorbs information the way fabric absorbs water, slowly, without any single moment you can point to, until it is simply saturated. An aunt who had noticed something unusual about the frequency of Amir's visits mentioned it to her husband. A cousin who had been present for an interaction that left her with an uneasiness she could not articulate mentioned it to her sister. Nothing direct, nothing accusatory, just the slow accumulation of noticed things, of whispered uncertainties, of the question that nobody wanted to ask out loud, because the answer, if true, was the kind of thing that does not stay contained once spoken. By early 2014, Faisal had been carrying a suspicion so heavy and so specific that it had changed the quality of his silence when he was home. Not angrier, exactly, not colder. Something more frightening than either of those things. He had become watchful in the particular way of a person who has already formed a conclusion and is looking for the evidence to confirm it. He found it in March of 2014. He found it, as so many people find these things in the modern age, in a phone. He found messages. Not ambiguous ones, not the kind that can be explained away with sufficient creativity and sufficient desperation. Explicit and specific and completely unambiguous messages that confirmed everything the whispers had been suggesting, and more. He did not confront Samira. This is the detail that the people who knew Faisal found, in retrospect, most alarming. He did not shout. He did not demand explanation. He did not do the thing that an angry man does when he receives confirmation of a devastating betrayal. He put the phone back where he had found it. He said nothing. He carried what he had seen inside himself, and he waited. What was happening inside Faisal in those days between the discovery and what came next is something we can only approach through imagination, because the man who might have described it was not the same man after March 6, 2014, and the accounting he has given in legal settings is not the accounting of someone describing an internal experience. He was a husband who had discovered that his wife and his father, had been conducting a secret life inside his own home. If there is a more complete violation of trust than that, it is difficult to name. The institution of his family, the honor of his house, the private world that a man builds around himself and calls his life, all of it had been systematically betrayed by the two people whose betrayal was, within the framework he had been raised in, the most unthinkable possible. He came home early on March 6th. Whether this was planned or spontaneous is something the courts examined carefully, and the answer they arrived at was ambiguous enough to become a significant factor in what followed. What is clear is that he returned to the house at a time he was not expected, that the house had an unusual quality of occupancy he noticed immediately upon entering, and that he moved through it toward the sound of voices coming from a room where no voices should have been. He opened the door. What he found on the other side of that door is something that human beings have been encountering in one form or another for as long as human beings have existed. Betrayal, made viscerally, undeniably concrete. The thing you feared, confirmed in the most total way possible, leaving no room for any of the rationalizations or uncertainties that had given the preceding days their particular torment. There was no longer any question. There was nothing left to wait for. Have you ever felt the kind of anger that makes the world go completely black? Not the hot, immediate anger of an insult or a frustration, but the deep, detonating kind that comes from the place in a person where identity and humiliation and love and grief all collapse into a single force that is no longer anything so manageable as emotion. That is what happened to Faisal. The people who were there, in the terrible moments that followed, would later describe it as something that seemed to happen outside of time. Not a sequence of decisions, but a single, annihilating event. There was a decorative knife on the wall of that room, the kind of ornamental blade that wealthy households in the Gulf sometimes display. Not a weapon in any practical sense, not something placed there for any functional purpose, simply an object on a wall that had been there so long it had become invisible. Until it wasn't. Faisal's father died in that room, on the floor of his son's house, on March 6, 2014. Samira was present. She has described the moments after the door opened and before the police arrived as the worst of her life, which is a sentence that contains more than it is possible to fully comprehend. The police arrived. Faisal did not flee, did not deny, did not attempt to construct any narrative other than the one that had occurred. He was arrested at the scene. He was cooperative in the specific way of someone who has passed through something so total that resistance to what comes next seems beside the point. The investigation and the legal proceedings that followed were conducted within the Saudi judicial system, which applies principles of Islamic jurisprudence, and which, in cases involving what is defined as crimes of honor within a family context, exercises a form of discretion that differs significantly from the legal frameworks of Western jurisdictions. This is not an editorial observation. It is a factual one, and understanding it is necessary to understanding the outcome. The prosecution established the facts of the homicide without significant dispute. Faisal's legal team did not argue that the killing had not occurred, or that Faisal had not been responsible. What they argued, with significant support in the evidentiary record and in the framework of the court's discretion, was the nature and severity of the provocation. The discovery. The specific identity of the parties involved. The particular character of the violation, within a legal and moral framework that recognizes the destruction of family honor as a category of harm with its own weight in the calculation of culpability and consequence. The court, after lengthy deliberation, sentenced Faisal to 15 years. Samira, whose role the court characterized in terms that the proceedings made clear, and that the outside world has viewed with significant disagreement, was sentenced to 10 years. The legal characterization of her conduct, not as victim, not as someone whose own choices were made in the context of isolation and a power imbalance with a man 2 generations her senior, but as the principal agent of the family's destruction, reflects a framework that many people outside that system find deeply troubling. It is worth sitting with that discomfort rather than resolving it too quickly in either direction. There are no simple heroes in this story. There are no clean villains. Though Amir's conduct, his deliberate cultivation of a young woman's loneliness, his exploitation of the position of trust he held within the household, his willingness to pursue something so devastating for so many people in pursuit of whatever it was he was pursuing, makes him the closest thing to one. There is a dead man, and a man in prison, and a woman in prison, and there is a family that was destroyed not in the moment the door opened, but long before it, in the accumulation of small choices and large silences, and the human needs that went unmet and unfulfilled until they found their own terrible satisfaction. Samira had been 23 years old when she moved into that house, a new bride, a devout woman who had never had any intention of becoming the person this story made her into. She had been lonely. She had been unmoored. She had made a catastrophic choice in response to those real and legitimate feelings, and that choice led her to a decade in prison and to the permanent collapse of everything that had constituted her life. The loneliness she had felt in 2008 was real. The choices she made in response to it were hers, and the consequences of those choices were severe. Both things are true simultaneously. Faisal had been a husband who was absent in every way that mattered, who provided materially and failed humanly, and who responded to the most devastating discovery of his life with violence that killed his father and destroyed whatever remained of his own. Whether the anger that drove him deserves the understanding the court extended to it, or whether the same violence against different parties would have been treated differently, are questions that the case continues to raise without easy resolution. And there is the daughter. Samira and Faisal had a daughter, a child who was small when all of this happened, and who became, in the aftermath, a person defined by an event she did not choose and cannot explain, and will live with in whatever way she is able. In these stories, we follow the adults. We almost always forget the children. But they are there. They are always there. I have told you this story as carefully as I know how to tell it. I have tried not to sensationalize the culture it comes from, or to flatten the people in it into the simple shapes that make difficult stories easier to consume. The truth is that what happened in Riyadh in 2014 was not a story about religion or culture or honor in any abstract sense. It was a story about loneliness and need, and the catastrophic consequences of meeting those things in the most dangerous possible way. It was a story about what happens when human beings, with all their ordinary fragility, are held inside systems that leave very little room for that fragility to find safe expression. It is not a story that ends well for anyone. There is no resolution here that offers comfort, no final moment where justice arrives cleanly and the right people are punished and the wrong people are vindicated. There is a dead man and 2 people in prison and a child growing up in the wreckage of a family, and questions that a court's verdict does not come close to answering. What I can offer you, instead of resolution, is this. The most dangerous distance in the world is not geographical. It is not the distance between countries or continents or cultures. It is the distance between 2 people who live in the same house and have no way of reaching each other. It is the silence that grows in the space where communication should be. It is the loneliness that settles into a marriage when both people are too constrained by expectation, by tradition, by the particular difficulty of being human, to say the true thing out loud. That distance is not specific to any culture or any faith or any part of the world. It is one of the oldest and most universal of human experiences. And when it goes unaddressed long enough, it has a way of making choices that its participants would never recognize as choices at all. Be careful with the distance. Be very careful with the silence.